Good morning. Welcome to a tertiary world. Stories of memories of walking along each of 14 streets in inner Melbourne. 7 north-south streets and 7 east-west streets. I'm up to the 5th north-south street, and these walks were part of a performance I presented in 2008. As I would walk along each of these 14 streets, I would note the first 7 memories that arose, and I would write them down. These are the first 7 memories that arose of Canning Street as I walked it in 2008. This is the first memory. Each street was allotted a colour, and Canning Street is blue. Each memory has a colour, and this first memory is red. It's of 570 Canning Street. The sounds you hear is the kind of clanking of the building, the metal sheets, as the wind kind of rushes in from the mallee. The sounds of the mallee, the music of the mallee, if you like. 570 Canning Street. I first saw number 570 from the opposite side of the street, from the front yard of the house that Joy and her father Luciano lived in. 570 seemed sun-drenched and cheerful. Angelo and his wife, friends of Luciano's, were about to move out, so they asked my parents whether they wanted to rent it. A year or so earlier, Angelo had commissioned me to make him a painting. He specifically wanted a painting of a giraffe. I was 19 and it was my first commission. I charged him $20 for a painting of a giraffe on a 3-foot by 1'6" masonite board, which he later told me he had proudly installed over his living room fireplace. The house at 570 turned out to be airy and full of light. We spent a lot of time on the upstairs balcony overlooking the elms growing in the centre plantation that went all the way to the exhibition gardens. At night, everyone sat on the grassy centre strip on chairs they dragged from their kitchens and backyards. People would laugh and talk in sing-song, lilting tones right across the street to others in their families sitting in front yards or up on balconies or even leaning out of passing cars. Soccer matches were constantly being played in the dark around the chairs, and great skill was needed to contain a move within the restricted spaces. Wasn't just young hopefuls that played either, but a few state league players would inevitably also be there, as keen as any of us to hear the sweet thud of the ball being caressed or pushed skillfully between eager, waiting feet. At the beginning of autumn, the Brunelleschi-inspired dome of the exhibition buildings would begin to reappear, and from midwinter it could be plainly seen from the balcony through the bare branches of the elms. My upstairs bedroom had an easel in the corner. One dark night I remember pressing my ear against the floor, listening to my parents in the living room below, anxiously discussing their son's future. On another night, that of March 6, 1969, I lay in my bed stricken. Earlier that day my sister had married, and after the ceremony in St. Patrick's Cathedral, we all went to the reception held in the newly renovated house in which she and her husband were to live. I came home from the wedding in the middle of the night, desperately unhappy and very drunk. I sensed that whatever was between them would never be able to sustain her restless life quest, and I could not bear to watch her begin the long walk into the dark tunnel of her future unknown. Occasionally during my first year of university, I would come home to have lunch with my grandmother. We would talk in her room by the light of tiny flames flickering in little oil burners. One day in the spring of 1967, I arrived to find the house flooded. She was standing by the sink, unable to move. She had just suffered a stroke and she had simply forgotten how to turn off a tap, or perhaps even what a tap was. She tried to explain something to me, but she couldn't get the words out. Eventually, after great effort, she managed to tell me the tap should be turned off, and she smiled triumphantly as she made a show of ensuring I had now turned it safely off. We waited for the ambulance in her room, and she sat on the bed in silence, looking at the floor. She felt desolate at what had happened, as though it was somehow her fault. She felt humiliated by her inability to speak. Tears flowed out of her eyes, though she probably had no idea why she was crying so softly. I stroked her white hair until the ambulance attendant knocked on the front door. I rode with her to Royal Melbourne Hospital, holding her hand while we glided in an astonished silence through familiar streets. As I looked through the tinted windows onto a muted landscape, I remember thinking that what I was witnessing was the world as it really was, and as it had always been up to this moment, because I knew that from this point on, it would be changed forever. I didn't understand it at the time, but living in Canning Street was the closest we ever came to being home, and at times I've wondered what it would be like to live in 570 again. When I occasionally drive past the house, only very occasionally because I mostly avoid it, the street is always empty. There are no chairs on the grass, no games anywhere, no talk, nor laughter. But the camellia bush is still there in the tiny front garden. It's grown much bigger with greener, denser foliage. In the 40 years since our departure, I've never again chanced to see any of those scarlet, velvet-petaled flowers that burst out all year round from its symmetrical shape. Radiantly pink at dusk or deep crimson on an early spring morning. Never. Just brown, sturdy branches and hard, thick, shiny, green leaves. Sometimes following the recounting of the story, which is as new for me as it is undoubtedly for you, I mean to say something, to respond instinctively, but the minute the thoughts arise in my mind, there's an opposite thought that makes me aware of how futile it is to really say anything. And so you can probably see me on the verge of mouthing a few words, but also on the verge of turning off those flows, those thoughts. Tomorrow I move on to the second memory of Canning Street, the corner of Canning and Richardson Street. Thank you for giving me some of your time to listen to these accounts. Until tomorrow.